The first few cattle prones lumbered into the piazza, bellowing in anger. Green eyes glowed under their manes. Their long snouts blew clouds of gas, like furry little steam engines. Frank knocked an arrow. He had a momentary pang of guilt. These were not the worst monsters he'd met. They were basically grazing animals that happened to be poisonous. Hazel is dying because of them, he reminded himself. He let the arrow fly. The nearest catapult collapsed, crumbling to dust. He knocked a second arrow, but the rest of the herd was almost on top of him. More were charging into the square from the opposite direction. Frank turned into a lion. He roared defiantly and leapt towards the archway, straight over the heads of his second herd. The two groups of cattle prones slammed into each other, but quickly recovered and ran after him. Frank hadn't been sure that their roots would still smell when he changed form. Usually his clothes and possessions just sort of melted into his animal shape. But apparently, he still smelled like yummy poisoned dinner to them. Each time he raced past a catapult, it roared in outrage and joined the Kill Frank parade. He turned onto a larger street and pushed through the crowds of tourists. What the mortal saw, he had no idea. A cat being chased by a pack of dogs? Maybe. People cursed at Frank in about 12 different languages. Gelato cones went flying. A woman spilled a stack of carnival masks. One dude toppled into the canal. When Frank glanced back, he had at least 24 monsters on his tail, but he needed more. He needed all the monsters in Venice, and he had to keep the ones behind enraged. He found an open spot in the crowd and turned back into a human. He drew Hazel's spatha. His preferred weapon? Not really. But he was big enough and strong enough that the heavy cavalry sword didn't bother him. In fact, he was glad for the extra reach. He slashed the golden blade, destroying the first caltrops and letting the others bunch up in front of him. He tried to avoid their eyes, but he could feel their gaze burning into him. He figured that if all these monsters breathed on him at once, their combined noxious cloud would be enough to melt him into a puddle. The monsters crowded forward and slammed into one another. Frank yelled, "You want my poison roots? Come and get them!" He turned into a dolphin and jumped into the canal. As he hoped, the cattle prones couldn't swim. At least, they seemed reluctant to follow him, and he couldn't blame them. The canal was disgusting, smelly and salty and as warm as soup. But Frank forged through it, dodging gondolas and speedboats, pausing occasionally to chitter dolphin insults to the monsters, who followed him on the sidewalks. When he reached the nearest gondola dock, Frank turned back into a human being again, stabbed a few more cattle prones to keep them angry, and then took off running. And so it went. After a while, Frank fell kind of into a daze. He attracted more monsters, scattered more tourists, and led the now massive following of cattle prones through the winding streets of the old city. Whenever he needed a quick escape, he dove into the canal as a dolphin, or turned into an eagle and soared overhead. But he never got too far ahead of his pursuers. Whenever he felt like the monsters might be losing interest, he stopped on a rooftop, drew his bow, and picked off a few of the cattle prones in the center of the herd. He shook his lasso of poisoned vines and insulted the monsters' bad breath, stirring them again into a fury. Then he continued the race. He backtracked. He lost his way. Once he turned a corner and ran into the tail end of his own monster mob. He should have been exhausted, yet somehow he found the strength to keep going, which was good. The hardest part was yet to come. He spotted a couple of bridges, but they didn't look right. One was elevated and completely covered. No way he could get the monsters to funnel through that. Another was too crowded with tourists. Even if the monsters ignored the mortals, that noxious gas couldn't be good for anyone to breathe. The bigger the monster herd got, the more mortals would get pushed aside, knocked into the water, or trampled. Finally, Frank saw something that would work. Just past a big piazza, a wooden bridge spanned one of the widest canals. The bridge itself was latticed an arc of timber, like an old-fashioned roller coaster, about 50 meters long. From above, in eagle form, Frank saw no monsters on the far side. Every catapult in Venice seemed to have joined the herd and was pushing through the streets behind him, as tourists screamed and scattered, thinking maybe they were caught in the midst of some stray dog stampede. The bridge was empty of foot traffic. It was perfect. Frank dropped like a stone and turned back into human form. He ran to the middle of the bridge, a natural choke point, and threw his bait of poisonous roots on the deck behind him. At the front, the first caltrops reached the base of the bridge. Frank drew Hazel's golden spatha. "Come on!" he yelled. "You want to know what Frank Zane is worth? Come on!" He realized he wasn't just shouting at the monsters. He was venting weeks of fear, rage, and resentment. The voices of Mars and Ares screamed right along with him. The monsters charged. Frank's vision turned red.